On this week's episode, we're going to be interviewing Artyom Zorin of Zorin OS, who is right here.
Yeah.
Hi, guys.
Woohoo! Welcome to Destination Linux, where we discuss the latest news, hot topics, gaming, mobile, and all things open source in Linux. But today we have a very special interview, yes, once again, with Artyom Zorin of Zorin OS. My name is Jill, and joining me are my students who excel in their use of negative space, Ryan and Michael.
I just knew a teacher would get me one day, Jill. And the fact that you're a professor and found something good to say about my work, good use of negative space is really special to me. Thank you, Jill.
Aw.
So I actually do know how to use negative space. This is not just a... But yes, thanks, Jill. Thanks.
Aw, I love you too, Michael. And we love you, RTM. Now let's get the show on the road toward Destination Linux. This week, we would like to welcome back to the show Artyom Zorin, the CEO and co-creator of Zorin OS. Artyom, thank you so much for joining us today. It's so lovely having you on.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Yay! Well, I think we're going to get right into it. First off, in case we have any new listeners to the show, tell us a little about yourself and how you got involved in open source software.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess the best way to do that is to go back all the way to the beginning, summer of 2008, back when I was 12 and my brother Kirill was 14, and that's when we first started using Linux. We just came across different videos of Ubuntu and some of the fancy effects that it had. Some of the old-time members, I'm sure, would remember Compiz.
The cube.
Cool, like desktop cube and the burning windows. So as kids, that really excited us. So we decided to start using Linux on our computer. But then we saw it was a lot more than just those fancy effects and features. It was also the big advantages of, how much more secure it is than Windows, how much faster it ran. Just in general, the user experience was so much more solid and seamless. And we kind of thought to ourselves, why isn't this more popular? Why aren't a lot more people using Linux? So we decided to show Ubuntu to our dad, who was a regular computer user, who was a translator by trade. And we got the answer pretty quickly why Linux wasn't as popular. And we saw like that, a normal computer user like him would struggle to, relearn the muscle memory to use the desktop. The fact that the start menu and the taskbar is not where it is on most computers was kind of jarring. And we saw that Linux didn't have that level of user friendliness and, design finesse that it would really need to have if it were to be a general purpose operating system for the general public. So we kind of set ourselves the mission to bridge that gap if we could. There was a science project competition that was happening around that time, and we thought, let's enter into this competition, and as our project, let's try to make a Linux distribution that would be really user-friendly and seamless. And so that was the beginning of Zorin OS.
Very nice. It's interesting in your story, like that your dad was into computers, and because I was thinking it's really young to get into computers as a young teenager and to be like, hey, I want to try this new thing, Linux. And what was your influence to be involved in technology at that level back then?
I mean, like, my brother and I, we've always been interested in science and technology. Like, growing up, we'd watch, Discovery Channel documentaries, and we were really fascinated by just that whole world. And we kind of thought to ourselves, it would be cool to get into that industry someday. And the fact that our imagination was captured by Linux and we were really enthusiastic about it, that really motivated us to start early and focus on what we were really interested in, which was, making Linux more accessible. And it was a great learning experience. Like, we've never programmed in our lives before. So we learned a lot along the way. So I
think 13, 14-year-old you would be very proud of how things turned out. That's pretty cool. Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. I got started in tech early for the same kind. Like my siblings were into tech, and they got me into tech and that sort of thing. So I kind of feel like a similar vibe there. But you're talking about Zorin OS and how it kind of you were inspired to make it. So let's talk about Zorin OS and who would you say it's designed for? Like you talked about a little bit with the your dad and the beginners and stuff like that. Is that the main focal point?
Yeah, I'd say so. Like, since the very beginning, the main aim was about how do we make a Linux environment more user-friendly and really ready for, the general public, which by and large are Windows users. So how would we make the system more familiar to Windows users? And since the very first version of Zorin OS, like, the main focus is on, the desktop experience and the design of it, and just making it as simple and intuitive to use for a normal Windows user. And that's always been sort of the North Star that guided our decisions on how we built Zorin OS for all those years since.
Makes total sense. I mean, we were talking in the pre-show earlier about the fact that I'm still utilizing Zorin OS, which Artyom is a miracle, not because Zorin OS or other distros aren't great, but because I've stayed on a distro for longer than 3 months.
This is actually, you should feel massively accomplished, Artyom.
Yeah.
In order for him to stay on a system for any longer than even a couple of weeks is crazy.
And I think we're going on 8 months or so.
At least.
At least. Yeah.
Been a while.
Impressive, yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things that they tease me about, Artyom, is that I never theme stuff to the point where, like, Michael tells a story about coming to my home and I had a base XFCE install and I kept it base default, never change anything but the wallpaper. And what's great about Zorin OS is I don't have to be good at theming because it does it all for me. And I look like a professional. I look like I've customized the heck out of my desktop because Zorin OS looks so good out of the box. And so it kind of works out that way. So I love that.
You can pretend. Thanks.
I can pretend I know what I'm doing. Yeah, exactly.
And Zorin OS has the best implementation of the XFCE desktop with Zorin OS Lite. It's beautiful.
Yeah. You can make XFCE beautiful. You're doing something really well.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, we talked about a little bit about the aesthetics, but what do you think makes Zorin OS stand out against the giant distros out there that like you said, even when you're younger, you came across Ubuntu first. A lot of people's first distro might be Ubuntu or Debian or one of those. What is it about Zorin OS that you think makes it stand out from those?
Yeah, I think it's just our laser focus on making it as user-friendly as possible to that target audience that I just mentioned, and making sure that we're always taking decisions that support the user base that, we're really focusing on. We've been really fortunate that we've been able to keep this project running for over 15 years. And we can see that there are a lot of specific ways on how we think about, how do we develop new features? How do we design things that really resonate with that audience? So it's just making sure that you're totally focused and you know exactly who you're building the operating system for. And those users will gravitate towards the system that you're building. So it really is sort of a symbiotic relationship. We take a lot of ideas from the suggestions we get from our users, and as well as that, we make sure that, if there are any, user experience issues or paper cuts, you can kind of say, that make the system not as user-friendly and pleasant to use as it should be, that, we attend to those issues and make sure the operating system reflects the needs and the wants of the users as much as possible.
That's good. Love it.
Nice.
And I'm very curious about one thing. You were talking about how you had the beginner focus and stuff like that. And Ryan was talking about how well it looks and like the design is so great. And it just popped in my head. This is based on Gnome and looks nothing like Gnome in any way. And I have to ask, why did you choose Gnome over the other desktops when you're going to change so much?
Yeah, it's a variety of reasons. I think the fact that we're able to customize it and change it around so much is a testament to how extensible and extendable Gnome is. I don't think it gets enough credit for that. Like, the extension ecosystem is really vibrant, and the fact that you're able to, overwrite certain desktop elements just through essentially JavaScript extensions makes it so flexible. Even to a point where, a lot of other desktop environments might not have that ability, to customize the system so much. As well as that, like, GNOME is obviously a very, popular project, and it's very widely supported. So if there are any new hardware features, there's a huge community around it that develops to make sure that, those hardware features are supported. As well as that, like, there's a big emphasis on, making the design very intuitive and user friendly, and taking, new users into account when making decisions. Sometimes in open source software, there's the temptation to, add a lot of features, a lot of toggles, to the point where, it might even get a bit overwhelming for new users. And we find that, like, some of the design decisions that the GNOME team and the GNOME community make do take new users into account to make sure that, the software that they're making is designed to be as intuitive as possible. We don't agree with absolutely every decision that, the upstream GNOME developers make, but the fact that it's such an extensible desktop environment means that, we have the ability to tailor the Zorin OS desktop to the needs of Zorin OS users. And that's a really exciting thing.
Nice. I mean, that you're talking about how you're not necessarily agreeing with everything. I think Ryan can appreciate the fact that
I thought app indicators popped my mind immediately. Like, why? But they do make a lot of great decisions. So I completely agree with you, especially from a user interface. And I think it makes sense what you're saying about, hey, if we're trying to make a new user experience great, and let's say you started with the basic KDE, which is very flexible. There's lots of toggles. There's lots of switches to change stuff. But if you don't turn all of that off, a new user is going to get lost. They're going to be moving their panel in the middle of the screen, not know how to get it back, all this type of stuff. Where what's interesting,
literally
what I didn't even think of, what I didn't think of is like the fact that GNOME is flexible on the back end. Because we know when it's not flexible, it's not super customizable on the front end.
Not for users, really.
What you're able to do on the back end makes it so that you can customize it without having all those toggles or switches, or put the things in that your users want, such as app indicators.
Yeah, that's not something I thought of before, like the back end part of it. Like I know it's built on JavaScript, and that would be a lot easier to manipulate and stuff if you're familiar with that kind of thing. But in terms of like the users, there's quite a few barriers to get to extensive, like to just even install extensions. It's kind of there's barriers for that. But for someone who just wants to change it and modify it to be a certain way for the users to just start using, it makes sense. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and I think you had a really nice balance of users coming from Mac OS and Windows. You still have the bottom taskbar, but you can use a dock.
They even have like a Mac-like theme and a Windows-like theme.
Exactly,
well.
and that's the other thing is you can change the theming, which is you're one of the best distros that does that. Definitely.
Yeah, without a doubt.
So, Artyom, when we did our review of Zorin OS, of the latest release just a few weeks ago, we had asked the community and ourselves how you give back to the larger ecosystem. And you got back to us. Artyom actually got back to us and let us know how you contribute to Linux and the Linux ecosystem and all the things you do. And we talked about it here on the show. But just maybe reiterate or tell us again
in your own
about
words.
In your own words.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like, a lot of the work that we do for building the Zorin OS experience can end up being quite useful to other projects, other distributions. So, say for example, back in 2016 was when we started to switch over from our own desktop environment to a GNOME shell-based desktop environment. And we felt that the GNOME shell environment was quite mature and had a lot of advantages towards using it, and of course that extensible extension ecosystem. But some of the interface elements that we really needed in Zorin OS just weren't there. So we didn't have a suitable taskbar start menu, which are quite important, especially for Windows users. That's what they're familiar with. So that's when we began developing some of our own desktop extensions for GNOME Shell, like the Zorin menu, Zorin taskbar. And that ended up actually being a basis for some pretty popular GNOME Shell extensions like Dash to Panel and the original source code behind Arc menu, which we found some other distributions also use.
Nice.
So it's really cool to see that, the work that we're putting out there is also, being used and being loved by users outside of Zorin OS. Even just more recently, on a less glamorous note, there was a regression with how Ubuntu handled, I think it was the latest available NVIDIA drivers. Unfortunately, some GTK4 apps would not open, and it was just a bug there. But we helped the Ubuntu team to find the source of the issue and to resolve it. And that, of course, helped both our users, because Zorin OS is based on Ubuntu, but also all of the Ubuntu 22.04 users. That patch made its way out to them. So that was, I believe it was around a month ago. And it's cool to see that, on an open source ecosystem like the Linux desktop, you're able to see that cross-pollination of work that is being done by some project over here make its way out to a completely different audience that the original developers might not have thought of. And that's only possible because of the open source way.
Yeah. So fundamentally, you feel like when we were talking on the show, when we were talking about this in general, that it is important that distros, that whether they base themselves on another distro or whatnot, are giving back. And you guys clearly are. But is that's something that you felt compelled early on that you wanted to make sure Zorin OS was about? Is that a big part of, how you guys think and look at these projects?
Yeah, I think that, the fact that, we've been able to stand on the shoulders of giants and all of the open source projects that came before us, like the Linux kernel, the Ubuntu project, GNOME. We thought it was important to, make our code out and available to everyone else. So if anyone else wants to start a new project, they can build on our shoulders and make a new, experience that we hadn't even thought of. And I think that's a really cool thing that's just not possible with, proprietary systems and proprietary software.
It is uniquely open source. I love that. Yep.
Yeah, that is awesome. It's kind of a challenge to, get involved in certain kinds of projects if you're like, if you're not familiar with certain things. But I'm curious, like what kind of challenges have you had with Zorin OS just developing and in general? Like, have you had any challenges that you've come across that maybe helped shape the development of it in the future and like design or anything for their desktop?
Yeah, I mean, if we go back to the very beginning, like I was 12 and my brother was 14 when we started developing Zorin OS, and we had no experience in programming at all. So just those first few steps were quite challenging. We had to, learn Python from the Python for Dummies book and a few YouTube tutorials.
I didn't realize it was going to go into the point of like, what was the biggest challenge? Learning to program. Like, that's a big step.
I love it.
I mean, like awesome. The very first step towards learning programming, at least in our case, was setting ourselves the challenge to, make Zorin OS and make all of the features that we wanted to, include in the system. So we had to, learn, the programming craft to get ourselves to that level, rather than, the other way around where, if you go to college, you'd learn the programming stuff first and then you'd figure out what do I use those skills for. But also, say, for example, those GNOME shell extensions. Back in 2016, when we decided to switch over to GNOME shell base and start making those extensions, there wasn't the level of documentation that there is right now for GNOME extension developers. So in many cases, we had to sort of reverse engineer it, look at the source code of GNOME Shell to see how it worked and how we could implement certain features
Awesome.
in our extensions. But, even though that there wasn't that level of documentation back then, the fact that, GNOME Shell and obviously the wider open source ecosystem, you can see the source code behind it, means that anyone can see how it works and anyone can build on top of it. Again, something that's uniquely open source, only possible here.
True.
Oh yeah.
So it was a really cool way to learn about the system and about the components, and ultimately helped us to understand all of the inner workings of the desktop and how the operating system works, and allowed us to develop even more features, in the future.
It's awesome. I mean, like the fact that you started the project as a like a science project as a kid, and then you're turning into a business, and you're developing the skills to do it, and like that is like the fundamental. I don't know, not poster child or whatever, but like a great example of how open source is so powerful, because you don't need to have anything. There's no barrier to get started, and you can take it as far as you want to go, including making something like Zorin, that's just awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's an amazing story. And I think about all the young kids that we meet when we do Scale and other conferences, Michael and Jill, and like the next Artyom is sitting in that audience somewhere, right? That, gets inspired by this. Instead of drooling over TikTok or YouTube or Instagrams, they're over there building a new OS, which is just dope.
Yeah, you need to do the open source challenge, not the Tide Pod challenge.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. There is no shortage of opinions in Linux and open source. A lot of people very opinionated about things and how things should work. And so I was just curious, when you look at all the feedback that comes your way, whether it's on a new release or shows or news or other thing, how do you use that feedback in the development process? How do you weed out? I'm sure, like anything else, when you get big enough, you get some really negative, harsh stuff. You get some really kind stuff. You get a mixture of everything in between. How do you guys handle that feedback, and how do you use it effectively?
Yeah, no, like user feedback is a huge factor in how we go about developing Zorin OS even further. So we always strive to listen to what people are saying about Zorin OS, their experiences, what they like and what they don't like, and just making sure that as well, that the feedback that we're listening to can be used in a constructive manner, and especially aligns with the values that we abide by, but also by the needs of the users and the target demographic that we're hoping to develop Zorin OS for. Sometimes the features that some people suggest are actually like really useful, and we do end up including them and working on them. Sometimes it might align more with a demographic that might be better served by other distributions, maybe more technical users. But also, one of the key ways that we develop new features and figure out how we can improve Zorin OS is actually looking at some of the customer support queries that we get, and some of the issues and challenges that people might be having. Like, say for example, if a new user tries to install Zorin OS on a computer that might not be fully compatible with all of the drivers that are included in Zorin OS. Say, for example, like an NVIDIA-based computer a few years ago, it was more of a challenge to get started on. But that gave us the idea of, hey, why don't we just include the NVIDIA drivers in the default ISO? And that was one of the features that I believe we introduced in Zorin OS 15 that really cut down on the issues that some new users were having, because all of those drivers were available sort of out of the box. So that's just one of the examples of how we take user feedback and develop it into actual features that users see in the next version of Zorin OS.
Yeah. Wow, that's
Nice.
great.
Wow. So, what's one feature in Zorin OS that you think deserves more attention than it gets? The NVIDIA one was a pretty good one. NVIDIA drivers, yeah.
Yeah, I guess another feature that sort of was along the same lines as that NVIDIA one was the way that we handle what happens when someone double clicks on a Windows.exe or MSI installer file. So we noticed that, there were a lot of users who were very new to Linux and Zorin OS, and they were trying to get some of their favorite apps working. And they were struggling because, maybe the Windows App Support component, Wine, might not be fully compatible with that app. And when they double clicked on it and tried to install it with Wine, it might not have worked well. But we also noticed that some of those, negative experiences were when people were trying to, download the Windows version of apps that were actually cross-platform and natively available for Linux. So we thought to ourselves, how can we sort of design the experience in a way that guides the user to the right way of installing apps? So say, for example, someone might download the Windows installer for Slack or Zoom, or their favorite web browser, Google Chrome. They instead of prompting them to install Wine or the Windows App Support component, instead it says, "Hey, I noticed that you're trying to install this app that's actually natively available on the software store or from this web page directly for Linux. And if you do that, your experience will be better." So that's
Nice.
one of the features that we implemented so that users get steered towards the right way of installing apps, so that as they go on their Linux journey, they'll know, hey, instead of downloading the Windows exe, maybe let's check the software store to see if it's available there, and there might be a native Linux version of that app already there.
That's genius.
And so after implementing that, we saw that there were, it was a lot easier for those new users to get accustomed to, how you install apps in Linux and just ultimately improve the user experience.
That's awesome. I mean, that's actually, I've always said that Zorin is in the top 5 options for like the beginner distro. And with that feature, I'm more leaning to number 1, because that is such a good feature. Even if you don't have the software, to just tell them that there's like, here's a thing you can do. Here's another option. You can get it from the website or however it's, if you have it like specified for a particular application. Do you have like a database of that sort of thing that it just like scans to see what they're trying to install?
Yeah. So like every copy of Zorin OS has this sort of inbuilt database of some of the common Windows.exe installers, and it checks against that to see, hey, you're double clicking on an exe and it matches this app. Maybe you should take a look at the installer in the software store. I mean, it's not a very like super glamorous or technically impressive feature, but it does improve the user experience. Yeah,
it's a usability feature, which is sadly not the most important to some people, and I think it's great that you have that sort of thing. Another thing that's also good for like beginners is having compatibility of the hardware, like you're talking about with NVIDIA stuff like that. But there's also the element of like the kernel updates and that sort of stuff. And the latest blog post the latest release, the blog post for that release of 17.2, it says that it has hardware compatibility with the hardware enablement from Ubuntu. How does that work when it comes to Zorin? Like, how do you implement that?
The viewers might not know all of the background about Zorin OS. It's based on Ubuntu LTS releases, which means that the system gets a lot more security updates for a longer period of time, and it gets more widely tested. But at the same time, by default, the official Ubuntu LTS release might be stuck with the same kernel for many years if you get the initial release of that LTS version. However, the Ubuntu team also release hardware enablement updates for those LTS releases. So roughly every 6 months, they get the kernel version as well as some of the graphics hardware stack from the latest non-LTS releases, which typically come around every 6 months. And so we've made sure that newer point releases of Zorin OS get those HWE hardware enablement packages and updates out of the box, so that if you're using a newer piece of hardware, maybe with a newer CPU or graphics card, that it will have much newer drivers, that it will be able to support that out of the box. And so we make those point releases roughly every 6 months as well.
Because it sounds like you have so much user feedback. Let's say they get a new laptop, they get a new desktop, and maybe it's the new NVIDIA driver, maybe it's the new AMD processor that wasn't supported in the LTS. How do you guys handle those compatibility issues? Because really my biggest issue, and when I say issue, I mean it's the thing I would love to see Ubuntu improve on the most, which is their hardware compatibility, because 6 months is a long time in the hardware world. A lot releases in 6 months. And so you have a new user, which Zorin OS attracts. They buy the new computer at Best Buy. They come home. They didn't do their proper research. Let's say they try to install Zorin or Ubuntu, and it doesn't work, because even though we have a kernel out there that has that hardware enablement in it, we're using an older kernel in those versions. Do you guys try to do something with those, or you just tell them you'll have to wait, or it's not compatible? Or how do you handle those situations where there is newer hardware that's not compatible?
So, typically those newer hardware drivers get released in newer kernel versions, which, the Ubuntu team have been, working to improve the release cadence of them, especially recently. It is a factor where you have to take into account the balance between, the latest features and hardware support, as well as how well tested the kernel is. Because if you, release a brand new version of a kernel to all the existing users, there's always the risk that, there might be a regression, and sometimes the system might crash, because those ultra new versions of the kernel might have those kinds of issues that don't get widely tested upon release. So it is a balance between those factors. But we're always looking at ways on how to, include newer drivers out of the box. So is the Ubuntu team. And you're starting to see that a lot of those hardware vendors that contribute their drivers to the Linux kernel are starting to do it, earlier and earlier. So say, for example, if Intel is planning to release a new CPU, they often, include those drivers in, versions in their patches for that they submit to the Linux kernel team before the launch date of those components. So you're starting to see that, like, a lot of the hardware that might get released immediately might actually be supported in the latest version of Zorin OS or Ubuntu out of the box, because they did it so early ahead of time.
Gotcha. So, security is a very hot topic on people's minds a lot, especially since every day you open the news and it's another data breach and another data breach, and more of your information's out there.
Hey, guess what, Ryan? There's another data breach while you were talking.
I have no doubt. There's probably 50 data breaches while I was talking. And, honestly, a lot of people with things like Windows releasing their, snapback, recall features and things like that are starting to come to Linux. I see them going on Reddit forums asking about Linux. Hey, I'm not happy I don't want to switch from Windows 10, which I think loses support this month or really soon.
Next year, I think, actually.
Is it next year? Yeah. It's soon. And so people are really starting to inquire, wanting to come over to Linux for the first time. So talking about security, let's talk about how Zorin OS does security. How do you make sure that the environment that you're setting up is secure for your users, above and beyond what's already, built into the foundation?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the really important decisions that we took early on in the project was, do we build Zorin OS sort of as an entirely independent Linux distribution, or do we base ourselves on another existing one? And we ultimately decided that, for our use case, Ubuntu was actually a really good base. And a lot of that does have to do with the fact that, the security patches that, fix vulnerabilities are released very often, very quickly, because it's such a large distribution that's used in, servers, supercomputers, IoT devices, sort of all over the world, by so many different kinds of companies and organizations, that there is that level of support that they provide upstream that if we were to base Zorin OS on Ubuntu would make its way down to Zorin OS users as well. So that's why we decided to go down that route. And, the Ubuntu team have been doing a really great job to make sure that those patches to fix vulnerabilities do make their way out to all of those users on a really timely manner. And, that helps to make Zorin OS really secure out of the box because of all of the work that's being done by not only the Ubuntu team, but also the upstream developers on the Linux team, on other open source projects that are included in, the Ubuntu repositories. So all of those patches also make their way into Zorin OS. And also, as you were mentioning about, Windows and some of the decisions they've been taking over the past few months and years on a security standpoint, it is definitely a factor that we see is starting to, increase the user base of Linux in general, and of course Zorin OS by that part, because users are starting to see that, hey, I'm not so certain that Microsoft has, my intentions in mind when they're, developing new features like Windows Recall.
I think recall is fantastic because it shows that they 100% do not have their good intentions behind them for the people.
I think it's not about bad intentions always, as it is to what Artyom's saying is they're not thinking about the end user, because like the idea of being able, if you just look at it from the high level, superficial level, the idea of being able to recall what you've worked on all throughout the day actually sounds kind of cool, right? Like, oh, I forgot what I was doing over, earlier there was a website I was looking at and I can't remember what the URL is and I can go back. When you care about your users, you start thinking, hey, what if a hacker got a hold of that? What does that start to look like?
Or how do we make sure that this is not like, maybe we shouldn't send it to our servers and have everything that that they cost. Maybe we shouldn't do these things. That's a good point. Actually, when you were talking about, the way you're describing it, it made me think that the person who thought of this has like massive ADHD like me, and I would forget things that I'm trying to work on at that moment. And then like, oh, that would be great. But then I thought, yeah, that would be great. And then everything else beside it is awful. So
yeah, it's that looking deeper. Is this the best thing for the users, even though it's a cool feature to implement? And I think there's a lot of that going on right now with AI and things. And we'll get to that in a later question, because I'm interested in your take on that, where, we're looking at adding things without thinking about what's the overall impact it's going to have on people, society, whatever. So very interesting. And, one of the things, Artyom, I want to compliment you on is the fact that throughout this entire interview, you've just been giving credit to all the projects that you all work with, and I think that speaks a lot. Sometimes projects kind of hide the fact that they're based on something or that they work with other teams to produce something, whereas you're just very transparent, and it sounds like a partnership, which is how open source is supposed to be, and that makes me feel really great. So I love that you do that.
Yeah, thanks. Like it's only been possible to make Zorin OS because of all of those open source projects out there. So we're enormously thankful for all the efforts that they put in, and we're always happy to support other projects where they might want to use our code. And as an open source project ourselves, we're really happy to see that other projects are building on top of what we're doing. So it's a whole symbiotic ecosystem.
There you go. Mm-hmm. Perfect timing for the new Venom movie, the symbiotic relationship. Yeah. Love it.
Yes, nice. So what about like this? Have you any stories about users who have switched to Zorin OS and told you about their experience and maybe had like an impactful experience? Do you have any examples of that?
Yeah, I think like sort of a surprising example that happened a few years ago was there was a city in Italy called Vicenza. It's a few kilometers west of Venice, who actually decided to switch over all of their municipal computers from Windows to Zorin OS. Like on an informal basis. What happened was, it was an interesting story. There was a school in the area, and they were having issues with, the looming Windows XP end of life date. And they were left with the choice of, do we have to buy a whole load of new computers just to, run Windows 10 so that, our IT is still supported and up to date, which would have been like really expensive for, a school with limited resources. But one of the parents in that school, he knew about Zorin OS, and he thought that, installing Zorin OS on the existing computers could save them from landfill and also save the school a lot of money from having to buy a load of new computers. And they switched over their computers to Zorin OS, and it turned out to be a really great boon to the school. And that city municipality were having the same issue, where they had, I think it was like over 700 computers across all of their municipal offices running Windows XP, that they would have to buy new computers just to run Windows 10. And they saw that the school had a great experience with Zorin OS, and they just decided to deploy Zorin OS on all of their computers. And what was funny was that they just emailed us, I think it was 2 weeks before the deployment started, saying, we're about to switch our whole city over to Zorin OS.
Wow.
We were kind of panicking because nothing like that ever happened before. But like, we're really happy to say that, the deployment went pretty smoothly. There was a newspaper that came back to them around a year after the deployment and asked them how it went, and they were generally quite happy with it. So,
nice.
We were really surprised on the premise of whole cities switching over to our system, sort of on an informal basis, but we're really happy about that. And we also want to give a bit of a shout out to some of the people that made it happen. So shout out to Albano Battistella and the Vicenza Linux users group that basically made that deployment happen.
I mean, that's amazing. Talk about
wonderful.
a huge impact they had that kind of spread, the fact that they had that knowledge, they suggested this, it starts with the school and moves on from there. It really shows you, even if you want to work, a lot of people in Linux want to work in an environment where there's Linux, but we don't always have that option. But here, someone was able to make that happen eventually, thanks to Windows end of life situation. So you never know when you can kind of move your organization into.
That's when you get the Linux
realm.
user within.
The Linux user within comes out. Yeah, absolutely.
And speaking of that, Artyom, since we're on the topic of education, how does Zorin OS support educational initiatives or environments? We know that's a big mission for you, to support those environments. And this you probably learned from with the situation in Italy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So since even the early days of Zorin OS, we've always been releasing the education edition, which comes preloaded with a lot of software for teaching different classes like maths, geography, coding, science, all out of the box. And it's something that we've been working on since we were in school. So we kind of thought to ourselves, like, how would we make, a desktop experience that would improve the learning experience as well as we were going through that process. And, it's a project that we've been really passionate about for a really long time. And we're seeing that, there are a lot of schools also in Italy, all around the world as well, making use of Zorin OS education. Even a couple months ago, I saw a really cool project that's happening in Malawi. There's a couple of charities, I believe they're called K2 Tech and Bridges to Malawi. And they've been sending old decommissioned Windows laptops to Malawi, preloading them with Zorin OS education, giving them out to schools. And it's been really cool to see that, something that we've made here in Ireland is making its way out to places that we'd never thought they would be, and is making an impact, I hope, on the school children there.
That's awesome.
So kind of going back to what we were talking about a little earlier with the rise of AI, I'm just curious,
Speaking of making an impact.
And changes that things, because recall obviously is kind of made possible by these type of technologies we were talking about earlier. You see AI being talked about everywhere. So I have 2 questions for you. My first one is, what are your overall thoughts on AI? Like, do you think it's as big as people are making it out to be? Is this going to be a life-changing technology that's worth $8 trillion now with NVIDIA? What are your thoughts on that? And then second, Well, how's Zorin OS handling AI? Are you guys looking to implement it or integrate it in any way? And what are your thoughts there?
So, like, the developments in AI over the past couple of years have been, really interesting, really exciting. In some ways, somewhat scary. I'm sure, like, your viewers would share some of those sentiments.
Yeah.
But overall, I think, like, I'm quite optimistic in, how AI will be able to, help people and organizations to do what they want to do with their technology. At the same time, though, like, from the business perspective, I see that there's, a lot of buzz and hype around it that in some cases might not be fully warranted. Maybe some of your listeners and viewers might remember the dot-com bubble, for example. It was a little before my time, but there were similar hype cycles around technology trends that, over the long run, they might have materialized and made a big difference. But maybe some of those companies that were working on tools around that technology didn't end up surviving that hype period, because if there's a huge boom, there's probably going to be a bust sometime in the future.
What goes up must come down, right?
Exactly, yeah. And it calls out some of the companies that probably shouldn't have gotten the hype that they ended up getting, and maybe the investor dollars that they ended up getting. So it's like, from our perspective, we see that whole trend in the industry around AI to be kind of up in the air. I don't know exactly where it's going to go. There might even be some, developments in AI that might make current AI companies in many industries obsolete next month, for example. It's just something that you can't really predict, to a far enough time scale to see how it ends up. Like, from our perspective, we think about things a little bit differently. We don't really try to look at this cool new technology and see how to implement it. We kind of think of it the other way around. What features and what experience do we want to give to our users? And then how do we work our way backwards to the best technology to implement that use case?
So that's how you landed on implementing Clippy.
Of course.
Yes,
Okay,
yes,
cool.
Clippy. Yeah.
Major new feature. But yeah, it's that's just one of those sort of mental models, you can say, that led us to where we are today, led us to the product that we're able to put out, that so many people use and love on their computers. So we don't see AI as something that we ought to implement for the sake of implementing AI. There might come a time when there's an important feature that we think will benefit users that might make use of AI. But at the same time, we always want to make sure that those new features line up with our values around privacy and security, and making sure that the user always has control over what's happening on their computers. And that ultimately improves their experience. Like, I see a lot of companies sort of implementing AI features because maybe investors like the sound of it.
AI.
Yeah. Exactly, yeah. It increases the value of their company. In our case, we're entirely funded by our community. We don't have any investors behind us, which makes it so that we're always focused on the user and making sure that the product really lines up with their values.
I love that. I love that philosophy. It makes a lot of sense, and I love that you guys are sticking to your ultimate values. You see so many companies that start out with values, and then as they grow and get popular, those values go away, and then the company changes, and people don't like what it becomes because they lose that special sauce that made them. And I like the way you guys are looking at AI as, hey, when it's useful for our users, and it happens to be the technology that allows us to do that the best, then we'll implement it. Until then, we're kind of watching. It's interesting because Linus Torvalds also just this week was quoted as saying AI is 90% marketing and 10% reality. So I think that's an interesting way of looking at it.
That is definitely the case. I think that it's in terms of reality, it's just like how useful it is. Like the amount of people talking about it, that's probably a good percentage, because When you now see people talking about like AI devices that are so amazing, they're getting millions of dollars in funding, and they come out and they are complete garbage. Like it's it's basically hype at this point.
But they said AI, so you got to go behind it.
They
But I think
did
there
say
is some
that.
great things with AI. There's lots of great features in there, and we featured this really amazing app that lets you use all the open source AI locally on your machine. I wish I could remember its name, but maybe Wendy will pop it up here after our editing. But
I talked
could
about
see
this on a previous thing, and then like in a live stream, and then I couldn't remember either. Someone in the chat told me what it was. Wouldn't it be great if I remembered what they said in the chat?
GPT for all.
That's it.
GPT for all. Yeah, that's it.
Yep. See, I
GPT
was
for all.
giving Ryan more time to look it up, and he was able to do it. See, this is a team effort, right?
Yeah. So there's some cool things out there that I could see, having that, because what I find useful in AI is with fixing errors in code. Like when I'm writing code, which, I'm not that great to begin with. I'm not like you, Arty. I'm just barely write code.
He's in the early stage when you were like 14.
Yeah, I'm probably not even as good as you. So when I write code, though, it's very nice to be able to run it through AI, and it just is like, here's your error, here's the fix, and you kind of learn through that process. And I find it very good at things like that. Writing stuff from scratch, not so much. It puts a lot of errors on there. Answering questions, not so much, because it hallucinates a lot. But that stuff, like you said, could change next week. We could have this new AI that puts all the other AI out and stuff. So in any case, I think it's very, very interesting. Linus's take and your take as well on AI. So thanks for sharing that. Appreciate it.
So looking forward to Zorin AI, next week.
Clippy. Run by Clippy. Powered by Clippy. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. But really, so let's talk about like the transitioning that people have to go through from Windows and Mac to Zorin. There's obviously people who want to who are going from Windows to Zorin. It's kind of like the main thing because that's like the first default visuals that they see. Could you give some advice for the users who are considering switching to Zorin and like what benefits they would get from that?
Some of the benefits that we explained just even on our website, on our front page, we try to make it as clear and upfront as possible, just about, increasing the speed of your computer so you could be more productive. If you have old computers that might not be compatible with, the current or the upcoming versions of Windows, that, there's still life left in them. You can still use them just like they were new. And especially over the coming year, I believe Ryan alluded to this, but Windows 10 is losing support, I believe, around this time next year, so October 2025. And Microsoft has been informing quite a lot of users that the only way to continue having a supported computer is to just buy a new one, which I think is quite wasteful, especially if the computer runs just fine. So we're seeing a lot of interest.
And also ignoring of what people actually like, whether they can afford to buy a new one and all that sort of stuff.
Absolutely,
and some of the stuff that they're deprecating with the new versions and stuff are the computers that are perfectly fine. They're only like 7 years old or something like that.
Yeah, even newer ones than that. Like personally, I've been using a computer that's 9 years old for quite a long time, and it's been running just fine. In fact, like every time there's a new version of Zorin OS, it tends to run faster rather than slower.
Nice,
just because of the efficiency of it. And now that I believe maybe tens, if not hundreds of millions of computers are going to be obsolete this time next year, I think is incredibly wasteful. But at the same time, it's something that, Linux and Zorin OS can help bridge that gap and keep, people using the computers for longer. Not only just as they were using it before, but in a manner that's, more secure, faster in many ways, more flexible, and of course, privacy respecting. So from a new user's perspective, I think now is a really great time to consider Linux, even more so than even just a couple of years ago. We're starting to see that, a lot of the apps and games that people use are now natively available for Linux. And in some cases, the apps that they use might be web-based, which means they can run on any platform. So that app gap that was there back in the early days of Zorin OS that kind of stopped people from switching over from Windows to Linux is no longer as big of a problem as it was before. same thing goes with, hardware support, drivers. They've gotten quite a lot better than back in the early days. So a lot of those roadblocks that were there stopping people from using Linux are no longer as big of an issue. So, I'd say it's a really great time to start using Linux.
Never better time, really.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Especially with recall coming.
So, RTM, if you could describe the future of Linux in one word, I know might be a little tricky. One word, what would it be, and how is Zorin OS part of that future?
And why is that one word Tux Digital?
Yeah. What if he comes back with Clippy? I like that. Yeah.
This is
So
a hard
I'm
one.
going to cheat a little bit. I'm going to use 2 words.
Deal.
Not just like Tux
No
Digital,
problem.
but inflection point. I think, as I was saying earlier, right now is a really interesting time for Linux, where it's becoming way more viable of a general purpose operating system than it's ever been before on the desktop.
Mm-hmm.
The changes that are happening to Windows and the end of life of Windows 10 is, we think, going to be quite a big factor in getting a lot of new users over to Linux. And I think it's a huge opportunity. As well as that, the fact that, the quality of the Linux desktop and the experience that new users would be going through is just so much better than it was before. I genuinely think that, like, on the technology side, I think generally, like, Linux would be ready for the general public as it is today. At least the vast majority of users. I think the interesting opportunity to help make that happen, make that big migration happen, is to start focusing on distribution. So I know for quite a long time, the general consensus is we could get more people using Linux if, the manufacturers of laptops and desktops started preloading it. And there have been some interesting examples over the past few years where, say, for example, some of your viewers might be familiar with another distro called Endless OS. They've generally been focused on emerging markets, third world countries. And I believe a few years ago, they actually reached #1 market share for the operating system on new computers being sold in Indonesia, which was kind of mind-blowing to me. But unfortunately, that didn't really last very long because, some of the major manufacturers that they were partnered with, from what I heard, they essentially received a call from Microsoft saying, if you want to continue working with them, we might have to, alter our deals when it comes to, Windows licenses in other markets. And that was kind of a risk to their business, and it ended up not really allowing Endless OS and Linux to really thrive where it should have been. So we're kind of thinking of different ways on how would we bridge that gap? How would we get more people able to use Linux on a day-to-day basis? And we kind of thought that actually focusing on businesses, enterprises, organizations would be an interesting way to go. Say that example of Vicenza, the city in Italy that switched over to Zorin OS, was a success story in its own right. And we thought that why aren't more businesses and organizations using, Linux on their computers? And well, one of the bits of feedback that we did hear from Vicenza was that they were generally happy with Zorin OS. The main downside was managing all of the computers was a bit of a pain. So once they installed Zorin OS on their computers, if they wanted to make some sort of a change, like changing a setting or installing an app or updating software, they would have to send someone around to each computer individually. So that was clearly a big downside that sort of stopped organizations from being able to make that change just because it was too difficult to manage. So one of the projects that we're working on is called Zorin Grid, and that essentially bridges that gap.
Oh, nice.
Where IT administrators would be able to, manage their entire fleet of computers just from a centralized console. So if they want to, deploy a new app or change a setting on all the computers, they would be able to do that just from a single console. And we think that will be quite a big game changer when it comes to, allowing businesses and organizations to actually use Linux on a day-to-day basis. The IT managers in those organizations are able to choose what software that they use rather than, say, the hardware vendors. So they can pick whatever tool is best for them, and hopefully Zorin OS and Linux would be the best tool for a lot of them, especially now that they have to deal with the Windows 10 end of life debacle.
Nice. Yeah, will Grid be ready before Windows 10 before Windows 10 officially ends its support?
Yeah, so we're working really hard to make sure that it will be ready by then. We think it's going to be a huge opportunity.
Yeah. I love it.
That'd be a perfect timing to be able to switch over and everybody and stuff like that. That's awesome. I just had a couple more questions that I thought of on the fly. The currently Zorin OS 17.2 is based on 22.04 of Ubuntu. When do you think the next rebase for 24.04 will happen?
Yeah, so we develop new versions of Zorin OS and also just our software in general on a release when ready basis. So we don't have a set release date in mind, but we're expecting it to be ready in either the second or third quarter of next year. So again, just to be ready for that Windows 10 end of life period. We think it's an interesting time, and we want to make sure Zorin OS is on its best foot to take on those new users, and we think Zorin OS 18 will be quite exciting for that.
That's awesome, especially since Linux kernel 6.11 will be available for Ubuntu with the hardware enablement then, and that's going to be really wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I saw, maybe it's a rumor, I don't know, but I saw some people talking about how Zorin Lite might be going away. Is that a thing?
Yeah, so that was a decision that we came to that did take quite a lot of deliberation. We wanted to make sure that the roadmap for new features and new products around Zorin OS, we'd be able to execute upon that and provide the best user experience we possibly can. At the same time, on the desktop side, we were seeing a bigger and bigger mismatch between the features that we would be able to ship in the non-Lite editions versus the Lite editions going forward. And as well as that, from a performance aspect, we've been seeing that with every new release of Zorin OS over the past few years, the non-Lite editions have been getting faster and faster to the point where on quite a lot of hardware combinations, the performance of those non-Lite editions are actually exceeding the Lite editions. And so if we were to think to ourselves, we're a small team with limited resources, how do we provide the best possible user experience and as many new features as possible on a timely basis? What's the best way of going around it going forward? So we did end up coming to the decision to eventually sunset Zorin OS Lite in 2029. We wanted to make sure that the existing user base would have. Yeah, we wanted to make sure that the existing users would have a lot of time, and we didn't want to rush any decisions out of respect for them. So, from Zorin OS 19 onwards, so that's a couple of releases from now, we'll be focusing on just the non-Lite editions of Zorin OS.
That's interesting. And also, when I first heard about it, I thought maybe this is this might be an issue, but it sounds like if the non-Lite version, if it's the same speed, the same efficiency, and same resource usage, or close to that, then it kind of makes the point where the Lite doesn't need to exist, rather than it not going away. So I think that if that's that's the case, and there's 5 years from now, that makes a lot of sense.
I was going to say that's uniquely open source right there. What project's hey, we're going to get rid of this thing in 5 years? So that's really nice that you guys continue to support it for that long, for respect of the users.
And also just telling
it.
people that it's happening, you know?
Yeah, that's nice too. Yeah.
Zorin OS Lite won't be sort of like a curated version of Zorin OS from 2029 onwards, but you'll still be able to install the XFC desktop environment. You'll still be able to, have all of the features of that desktop environment on a Zorin OS based system.
Okay.
So
Nice.
it would be still possible to have a similar experience going forward indefinitely.
That's neat.
We just wanted to give the heads up like very early on that it's a project.
Okay, so
that
someone could,
we're
if they
planning
still
on
wanted it, they
specific.
could do it. It just wouldn't be like an ISO that was prepackaged for them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. That doesn't sound like a doom and gloom removal thing. That just sounds like a transition,
And that was particularly near and dear to my heart because I run Zorin Lite on lots of old computers. but I also know that Gnome, the performance of Gnome has gotten so much better, and you'll be able to install the other desktop manager. So.
Yeah.
Nice.
In fact, with Zorin, I often install Window Maker along with it as well.
Window Maker just fits in right in there.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's my go-to.
It's really cool to see how, different users might use Zorin OS in different ways that we wouldn't have been able to anticipate it. They might, install different window managers and desktop environments. And we think it's really cool that, you are able to do that. You're able to tailor your system to your own needs and desires. That's something that's, again, uniquely open source, uniquely Linux. And it's just really cool to see.
So at some point, we're gonna expect to see the Zorin OS Rat Poison edition.
Yes, that's another one.
Jill's use case is really unique, though, with all of her hardware museum. We call it the hardware museum, but she has thousands of computers. And a lot of them very, very old that she features on a special segment that we have for Jill's museum and, hardware museum. And the fact that, Jill, you rely a lot on Zorin is really, I think, a testament, right, for getting it running on those older machines that you have. I mean, we're talking really old machines and newer ones too, but you have some really old machines that you use this on, which is awesome,
Yeah. And in fact, I wanted to tell you, Artyom, I'm part of a local organization called the Linux Chicks of Los Angeles. And for one of our Linux install fests about a year ago, we featured Zorin OS on and showing people how to install Linux using Zorin. So that was really awesome. That's really cool because one of the reasons we chose it is because you also had the educational version, which is really good for the kids. And we have kids that come to our install fests.
That's really, really cool to hear. Really glad to hear that.
Yay.
So, Artyom, you have made it through this gauntlet of questions unscathed, but the real hard part happens now. This is the lightning round where we ask lots of arithmetic questions, all
We're
kinds of...
We're going to be talking about calculus, trig.
Yeah.
And
so get your... No paper, no notes, no AI to
I'll get my ChatGPT ready right now.
Get Clippy open real quick and see how that helps. So we're going to have a lightning round. It's just a couple of questions. We're going to ask just first thing that comes to mind. There's really nothing serious here in these questions. So we just want to have some fun, let people get to know you a little bit as well. You mentioned being a programmer. So I'm going to start with the first question, which is, if you could use only one text editor for the rest of your life, which would it be? Nano, Vim, or something else?
I mean... I'm a bit weird in that I just use gedit.
Yay!
Just the standard text editor in Zorin OS. I just find it's just simple, gets out of your way. So
do you use
I'm happy with that.
Do you use like the default vanilla, or you have like add plugins for ID stuff?
Just the vanilla one.
Vanilla?
I just like things simple.
That's awesome.
Wow.
I know it's very strange, but I like the simplicity.
I now want you to do like a live stream coding session so we can see how this all works.
Yeah. Artyom, what's your go-to snack that you can't live without, especially when you're coding and you're building Zorin OS?
I mean, I've tried to be a bit healthier over the past few years, so I generally reach for like an apple or a banana. I know it's a boring
Yay.
answer, but
No,
I know.
it's great.
I like it.
Good. He didn't tell us that it's dipped in caramel with nuts on it and stuff. Yeah,
That's my secret right there. That's my secret. I spilt the beans.
I
All right,
love
so
it.
we have a very deep one now. It's like imagining you're on a deserted island and you can only take one piece of tech, which also comes with a battery that you can charge. Or somehow it's a deserted island and also has power utility so you can charge it. What is that going to be?
An SOS locator beacon so I could get the heck out of there.
That's the most practical
Man,
answer.
that's a good one. I like that. All right, what's the last open source project that really impressed you? Could be software, distro, anything.
I come across a lot of them, just on FlatHub, just some of the apps that show up there. I think there was like one where it was just, an AI generated sort of photo generator kind of thing. And just playing around with it, the fact that it was like really simple and user friendly, it really spoke to me that I could just open it, type it in. I don't have to log into any service. I thought that was pretty cool.
Nice.
If you remember what it's called, let Ryan know so that he can use it because he definitely needs that for thumbnails on YouTube.
Hey, how dare you?
I'll look it up and let you know. Definitely.
So coffee or tea while coding? What's your preference? Which one do you like the best?
I generally go for tea.
Yay.
Coffee, unfortunately, is my kryptonite. I won't be able to sleep at night. So even though I do like the taste of it, I go for the tea.
What about decaf?
Even decaf is too much for me. I'm just weird.
The sugar.
So for the tea, is it Earl Grey hot? Just like Picard from Star Trek? Yeah. Sorry.
I generally go for like a berry tea or chamomile. Again, without caffeine.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So if you could talk with any person in the history of tech, who would it be?
I think Nikola Tesla would be an interesting person to talk to.
What a good
That's
choice.
a good one.
Oh, beautiful choice.
Yeah. That is a good one.
I feel like there's so much to his story about how, he was kind of ostracized and he was this genius is creating so many amazing things. That's a good one. I'd love to talk to him. Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's awesome. You made it through the lightning round. We got nothing else left for you. We got nothing else left for you.
We do have one special one that Ryan forgot. Which do you choose? Cupcakes or muffins?
Oh.
Yes.
Probably muffins. Keep it simple. Again.
Keep it simple.
That's right.
I guess I'm uninstalling Zorin after this.
Yeah. So
Awesome.
RTM, thank you so much for coming back to Destination Linux. We appreciate all the hard work you and your team does bringing Linux to more people around the world. We would love to have you back on again at the next major Zorin release.
Yeah, let's talk about the next Zorin release.
Yeah.
We have you back. You're going to talk about it, talk about all the great features and stuff. We got to have you back on for that.
Yeah.
And it won't be this long. It's been so long since you've been on the show. We have so much to ask you, but we'll do it in shorter increments so we don't have 2-hour interviews next time. Thank you, Artyom. We appreciate it.
Yeah, no, thanks so much for having me on. It's a blast as always, and I'm always happy to come back. Thanks so much.
Nice.
So we really hope you enjoyed that interview. I know we did. A big thank you to each and every one of you for supporting us by watching or listening to Destination Linux. However you do it, we love your faces. Want to come join our community on Discord and talk about the show and everything that went on, all the interview, all the questions that got answered, then head to tuxdigital.com/Discord. Add your opinions, thoughts there. And you can also send your comments in. You never know, could be used in the show.
Also, if you want to support the show, you can do that by going to tuxdigital.com/membership, where you can get a bunch of cool perks by becoming a member. You can watch the show live with us. You can also join us in the Patreon post show that happens every week after the show. And also, you can get access to the unedited episodes and so much more. tuxdigital.com/membership. And then there's so much more you can get. You can actually get some cool merch by going to tuxdigital.com/store. We have hats, mugs, hoodies, and so much more. tuxdigital.com/store.
And make sure to check out all the amazing shows here on Tux Digital. That's right, we have an entire network of shows to fill your whole week with geeky goodness. Head to tuxdigital.com to keep those Linux penguins marching. And everybody, have a wonderful week. And remember that the journey itself is just as important as the destination.
And head to Zorin.com.
Yes.
Thanks, everyone.